Chapter 6 and Chapter 7, I'm just going to combine into one lecture because they're not particularly long. So hopefully that saves you a little bit of time. Chapter 6 is all about interpretations. And an interpretation is just moving one step beyond an analysis because once you've analyzed something and picked apart all the pieces and found some patterns and some meaning, you need to draw a conclusion about what you've analyzed, and that is your interpretation. Just remember that an interpretive conclusion is not a fact, but a theory. So when you go to prove it or argue it or support it in your essays, don't think of it as something written in stone, but an idea that you need to develop and support. Excuse me. One thing you need to keep in mind is that there is no one correct interpretation. There are any number of interpretations that you can make, and it may not be correct to say that one is more correct than another, but one might be stronger or more well supported or more plausible than another. One might be more complex than another. So there are varying degrees of interpretation, I think, but that doesn't mean that one's right and one's wrong. And just because you interpret something and then someone else interprets it the exact opposite way, again, not right and wrong, just different. So a whole room of people could have a different interpretation about one text, and that's okay. That's the point of interpretation. That's a point of analysis. And I know I've mentioned multiple times, but analysis, again, is a little more on the objective side. But because you're starting to argue and support, that makes an interpretation more subjective. Okay, so that's when an objective analysis can turn into a subjective item, and that's your interpretation. When it comes to intention and interpretation, it's just intention refers to the author's intention as they sit down to write something. Just steer clear of that, really. At the 101 level, I don't run into too many problems of that. Just focus on the work. Focus on the text. Focus on what you see occurring there. Kind of ignore the author for now. You don't want to get mixed up in saying that, oh, well, Bob intended this. You have no idea what the author intended, so you don't want to presume to know because that hurts your credibility. Some things like cultural history can come through the author. Even the author's biographical information might come through the author, but you still don't want to profess to know what their intentions were when they sat down to write something. You can have an idea of what their message was, what their goal was, but not their intention. So steer clear of authorial intent. That can be really dangerous because you have no idea. And many times an author doesn't intend whatever is being seen. A perfect example of that is on page 139, I believe it is, with the ink art. And how the artist actually said, I just put ink on the paper and blew through a straw and I just saw these shapes emerging and they became the dancers. And I think that art is beautiful, but that's a perfect example of why you can't trust your idea of what they intended. She didn't intend to create little ink dancers. That's just what happened. And oftentimes that's what happens when an author sits down to write. Okay. So some other items I want to mention about interpretation is, interpreting everyday things. This is a huge pet peeve of mine. I'm not going to get on my soapbox for too long about this. All that I ask is that if somebody were to interpret something every day, by that I mean like the book gives the examples of Barbie and blue jeans, don't knock it just because you disagree with it. Another very prominent example are Disney princesses. Just because you see it as a harmless children's plaything doesn't mean that there's no meaning behind it. Okay, that's my soapbox. That's my huge pet peeve. So frequently students don't want to do the work, they don't want to analyze, they don't want to see a different perspective, they don't want to hear a different opinion. They just shut down and say, no, I'm not going to believe in that. And it's true. I've taught for enough years to know that it is very, very common. I used to, in my previous English 101s, I would have them read about Sesame Street. And the two female authors argued that Sesame Street was sexist for a number of reasons. And more often than not, every student would say, it's just a children's show. I watched it when I grew up and I'm fine. It didn't damage me. It's not damaging the children today. But that's not the point. Rarely is somebody who's analyzing something like that trying to prove that it's bad or negative. They're just making an interpretation. And just like I said before, There are any number of interpretations, and one is not more correct than another. Just like there's no one correct. If they see that occurring, if they see a cultural issue occurring within a children's TV show, that is perfectly plausible. Just because you don't agree with it doesn't mean that that problem does not exist. Does that make sense? So if somebody wants to analyze something as simple as bubblegum, they have every right to. And I really hope that this course will teach you the awareness to know that you have every right to do that yourself. Look at everything around you, challenge everything, question everything. Don't just go, oh, what a cute teddy bear. Look at that teddy bear. Why is it cute? What's making it cute? Why are teddy bears so attractive? Okay, really. Look at everyday things and see what starts to pop out at you. And then try to draw some interpretations about that. That's just a higher level of thinking. Ultimately, my pet peeve is when students shut down and say no. The problem doesn't exist, because it does, whether you want to see it or not. Okay, but enough of that. You guys are doing great so far this quarter, so I really hope that you can continue with that and look around you. Walk down the street and look at what's going on around you. That's when analysis becomes fun, because it's fun, right? You're having fun, right? A lot of work, a lot of fun. I can hope so. Anyway, just as there's no one right interpretation, not all interpretations are viable. Okay? That means that just because you think something doesn't make it true. You have to support it. You have to do your job, and some are going to be really weak. So weak that they're just not there. Okay, I hope that makes sense. The example I give is to read Chaucer or Shakespeare or Wordsworth or any amazing poet and say, oh, well, all poetry is great, so Chaucer is just as good as any Roses Are Red poem. That's not true. And interpretations are the same way. Just because you interpret something that way doesn't mean you don't have to do your work to make it viable and plausible. Okay, so let's move on to chapter 7. Chapter 7 is pretty much just all about making more common topics more analytical, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this stuff because I'm already going to have you reread it a couple times and put it into practice. So that's why I don't feel the need to really, nag you to death about it. But one sentence I truly love in this chapter is that analysis is worth a challenge, and hopefully you are coming to find that it is worth a challenge, because analysis can be fun. Like I just said, look at the things around you. That's when analysis becomes a part of you and your life, and that's the point. I don't care if you can analyze my articles that I sign. I mean, that's great, but it's just a stepping stone. I want you to be able to analyze in any context, not just in a classroom. And I don't want you to be able to analyze in my class and then never do it again. The point is to get this to be a part of who you are and what you do in your education. So, excuse me, I'm going to take a drink real quick. So when it comes to a personal response, I feel kind of mean saying it, but personal response just has very little place in college. The book has mentioned things very similar to that. I've probably mentioned it, that I don't want your responses. I want your analyses and reflections. Reflections are different than responses, that you still have to analyze what has occurred and what you've learned and all that stuff. So that's not really quite a response. But one thing the book mentions is that your opinion is something you earn, and I fully agree. Just because you read a chapter once doesn't mean you can have an opinion on it. It would be like me walking into a mechanic shop, telling the guys that they're not doing their work well and going off on my opinion of what they're doing. Okay, they look at me and think I'm nuts because I know absolutely nothing about mechanical work. Okay, you earn it based on your level of education, on your experience. And the more you gain and the more you know, the more you have a right to have an opinion. Okay, so the example of that, after I did my thesis, I can have an opinion on what I wrote about because I spent years working on that. Okay, does that make sense? So earn the right to have an opinion. Be so educated and aware of something that you can have an educated opinion about it. Avoid agreeing and disagreeing. This is something I'm trying to push in the discussion boards. I am seeing it a lot, but try to move beyond that. Don't just agree and disagree. Really try to add to the discussion. Move beyond just, oh, you said this so well, I totally agree. Add, okay? Go step up. And personal experiences are something that are good. Think of them kind of as like a pre-writing exercise. If you were to read an article that I'm asking you to write about, respond to it personally if you like. Kind of get a feel for it, see if you agree or disagree, but then forget about it. If you're going to go with the side that you disagree, start analyzing based on that, but don't go into your personal experience about it. Does that make sense? So it's a good place to start, but it has no place in your essays. So leave your personal experience out, but it's an okay place to start. Because ultimately, if you're going to write about something you don't care about, your writing's not going to be very good. So it's got to be personal to you at some level, but that level of personal association should not be visible in your essay. So hopefully that makes sense. So that's chapter 6 and chapter 7. Excellent ideas that are brought up in both of these chapters. But as always, if you have any questions about anything, let me know. And, keep up the good work and just keep chugging along and let me know what I can do to help you.